Thank you so much. My name's Andy Robertson. I'm a minister with the Free Church of Scotland, and I've been doing a church plant in an area of Dundee called Charleston. We've been there now for almost 7 years. Prior to that, I did my training in Chalmers Church in Edinburgh. I was there for 6 years training. So married to Kyrene, and we have 3 kids. Finley, who's 5, Lewis, who's 4, and Eliana, who's 2. And so I've just been away at the Free Church Ministers training inset, and now I'm here, and my wife has been left at home with those 3 rascals. So I've had the easier gig, definitely. Thank you so much for having me here to speak about the work that we've been involved in Charleston. Let me just say from the onset, this is not a talk on how to plant a church, because I'm still not really sure how to do that. But I hope it will be helpful, and just in sharing some of our experiences, I hope it will be helpful in thinking about the necessity of church planting and ways that you can support and pray for church plants, perhaps encourage your churches to do plants, or maybe move and be involved in some of these church plants that are now happening. I gather Neil was, I'm hoping this will feed in quite nicely to what Neil was saying yesterday. Neil was telling us about the need for gospel churches in Scotland. This is God's plan A for the evangelization of our nation. And so I hope today we'll see that. But in this session, I want us to really think particularly about how we do that in our poorest areas. Because they are areas that we've largely forgotten about, and the areas in our nation that are probably most starved of the gospel. So Charleston in Dundee is a low-income area. It's what we would call a housing scheme. And I want to talk just a bit about what it's like there and how we went about trying to start a church. There is I sent out a kind of presentation just so you get an idea of what it looks like and the various things that we do there. You don't need to follow along with that, but if you wanted kind of visual images of what Charleston's like and what the church is like, then that slideshow might be helpful. Can I also encourage you, if you have any questions, please do just shout them out as we go on, or you can save it to the end. I'll make sure not blather too much so that we've got a good time for questions, because I think that'll probably be the most helpful thing to do. So what is Charleston like? Like I said, Charleston's a scheme in the northwest of Dundee. Many of you will know this, but the schemes in our country were set up initially to house people who were involved in all sorts of industry work. So in Dundee it was shipbuilding, factory work, and the government set up these areas after many of these industries had been shut down, moved people who were involved in these industries into these schemes. Initially it was quite an idyllic thing. It was a wonderful thing to be put up in these housing areas. But here's the problem: when you shut down these industries and you move everyone together into this community, what you have is mass unemployment. And with mass unemployment comes issues such as addiction, crime, mental health problems, and these are issues that you will see across every single scheme in Scotland. Generally, that's what we see in Charleston as well. Now, Charleston is a scheme of around 4,500 people, just over 4,500 people in Dundee. 60% of the population would live in the bracket of the 15% most socially deprived people in Scotland. 43.8%, this is, by the way, these are statistics from something called the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, which is a really helpful resource. If you haven't looked at that, look at that website and you get a really good understanding of the various different issues going on in your area and in other areas. But 43.8% of the population would be unemployed. Now, take that statistic just with a little bit of a pinch of salt, because I think it was aimed at 16 to 70-year-olds. So some will be retired, some are teenagers. But nevertheless, that is what we see. There's a huge unemployment rate. Most of the guys that come to our church are on benefits and don't have a job. On average, just over a quarter suffer from some form of depression. We see a lot of mental health problems. I would say about 90% of the people that come to our church have some form of mental health issue, ranging from relatively mild to extremely severe. There's a huge drug and alcohol problem. If you come to Dundee, some of you might be from Dundee, you might have been in Dundee. You come to Dundee, you mention to a Dundonian Charleston, one of the first words that will come to their mind will be drugs. And that's what we see happening on our doorstep. Dundee is renowned for many things. You may also know that it was the drug death capital of Europe. There was more drug deaths in Dundee per capita than any other city in Europe. And actually, if you look at drug death statistics for Scotland as a nation, it is staggering, the drug and alcohol problem that we have in our nation in comparison to any other nation in Europe. It's staggering. And the Scottish Government is only now, starting to recognise that this is a very serious problem. We see it all the time. I remember we had a mission team from the States over in Charleston, and I was telling them about some of the work we do, and I was talking about some of the addiction work and the drug problems. And as if by design, our church is kind of like a big fishbowl. There's lots of windows looking out. Right outside the window, a drug deal was happening. Right there. It was 11 o'clock in the morning. And we see it all the time. In the scheme, in terms of their views on religion, in terms of their views on God and the church, nominally, Charleston is Catholic. So what I mean by that is that they support Celtic, and that's about the extent of their Catholicism. They'll have maybe been in church 3 times, maybe when they were wee for First Communion, and even then not many have done that, and for a funeral. Yeah, probably twice, and for funerals, not weddings. Not many folks get married that much anymore. So that it's nominally Catholic. They would say they're Catholic, though many people would know very little about Jesus. They will not have read the Bible. I've not met anyone who has yet. But very spiritual culture. I've not met any atheists. Very spiritual. I even had one girl say to me, I don't believe in God, but I believe in angels. And so it's kind of, you've got this nominal Catholicism, but you've also got this kind of New Age spirituality, and lots of kind of odd views on things, largely inspired by unhelpful documentaries on the History Channel or on YouTube. All sorts of crazy conspiracy theories. I've heard it all in Charleston, trust me. And as an area, not very diverse, predominantly white Scottish, but a growing community of Syrians and Polish, and now actually more recently in the past year or so, Nigerians. So that's kind of what it's like as an area. A lot of that might seem quite negative. Here's the great positive about schemes in general, and particularly in an area like Charleston. It is a great community. People look out for one another, they care for one another, and living there is a sense of community that I haven't experienced living anywhere else. And it's great to be a part of that. It's a wonderful thing to be a part of that. Now, why plant a church in this part of Dundee? It's not because of the great social needs, in which there are many, but ultimately it's because of the great spiritual needs. The main reason for planting a church in Charleston is that there is not one evangelical gospel witness in that housing scheme. And what you find in an area like that, some of you might be from schemes or have done ministry in housing schemes, most people tend to have been there for generations. How are they going to hear the gospel? As Paul says in Romans 10, how can they believe in the one that they have not heard of? These guys aren't going to come into the city centre to go to a church in the city centre. They'll probably only ever come there in the town centre at Christmas time to do their shopping. They're certainly not going to come there to go to church. And so the church needs to go to them. And whilst there is some work, some of it's great work being done by a handful of churches, we have to say with all honesty that the evangelical church scene in our nation is predominantly middle class. It just is. 48% of the population of our country live in a housing scheme. It's almost half. And if we are not reaching these communities, we are not reaching the nation. And when you look at church history, and because the gospel is so countercultural, and even when you look at Scottish church history, it seems that the gospel often spreads through a nation, not from the top down in society, but from the bottom up. It begins with the least, with the poor, and it works its way up. And so this is a dire need. And I can't really speak for any other organisation or any other denomination, but speaking on behalf of my own denomination, the Free Church of Scotland, this is an area that we have as a denomination forgotten. We've forgotten the poor. The very thing that the apostles asked Paul not to do when he was welcomed in Galatians 2. The very people that Paul was eager to let the apostles know that he would not forget. And when you look at the history of, again, just speaking of the Free Church, you've got guys like Thomas Chalmers, you've got guys like Thomas Guthrie, you've got guys right at the very onset that this was a priority for them, trying to reach the poor. I'm part of an organisation called 20 Schemes, which wants to plant churches and schemes across Scotland. And Mes McConnell, who's the director of that organisation, he always says, he's like, 20 Schemes is not an original idea. I took it from Thomas Chalmers. This was his idea. And largely, but now it has largely become forgotten. However, saying that, I think in the past decade it has been really encouraging to see a renewed impetus in this kind of ministry within my own denomination, and it seems to be in other denominations and organisations too. And so for my wife and I, we wanted to be involved in setting up a church in an area like this. Now, I'm from Dundee, and the opportunity came up with St. Peter's Free Church in Dundee to plant in the area of Charleston. They'd been doing some kids work there. They were keen to see a church established there. And so we moved there. We came up with a plan with the session, approved it. The presbytery then approved it, and my wife and I moved to Dundee to begin this work. So how did we do it? Well, it was really, really hard. We started with a small team of about 10 people from St. Peter's that formed the core, and it was really key for us that we kept that core team small. The aim is that we will have a church in Charleston made up of people from Charleston, but we didn't know anyone in the scheme at this point. And so we needed to keep that team small, otherwise the danger is we could end up just planting a middle-class church service in the scheme rather than a church for the scheme. And all these guys that don't actually live there come in, they worship on Sunday, and then they leave again. And we didn't want to do that. We wanted to reach these people. And right from the onset, that's why we made it clear to the guys that formed up this core team, you need to be living there. You need to be in this community. That is a key thing about a scheme, and certainly Charleston, is the community nature. And you will never be integrated into that if you're not living there, sharing life with people. It's so important. And so the first year, we just lived in there. We got to know people. We got to know Charleston. It was really kind of a year of research. We got involved in things like the local community centre. In fact, my wife and I were quickly taken onto the management team of the community centre, which was great. We got to know other parents. Others in the team got involved in local kickboxing club, Zumba classes, a local gardening club somebody was involved in. Any way that we could just get to meet people and get to know them. Going to the local barbers. One of the first people that came to our church when we started was the barber that was next door to us. Going to the same shop. Just getting to know people, but with that kind of missional intentionality. And as a core team, we would get together every week and we would ask ourselves these kind of questions. What are people's hopes and aspirations here? What do they look for in life? What do they think the problem with the scheme is, with the world is? What are their cultural idols? How do they view the church? How do they view God? And we would discuss that rather than assuming that we know what they're thinking. We would discuss what we think those answers would be based on our interactions with people in the community, so that we could think strategically, how do we reach them with the gospel? It's that old cliche of there's no point saying Jesus is the answer if you're not listening to the question. What is the question? And we would also meet as a core team to study the Bible and think through our ecclesiology. What is the church? What is the gospel? What is it that God has called us to be in this community? And it was through that we saw that we wanted to be a church in Charleston, made up of people from Charleston that did 4 things. And these are not original. I think they're from the Bible, but I actually bumped them from Robin Sidsurf, my mentor. These are the 4 things that I learned in Chalmers, and we wanted to do it here in this context as well. Firstly, we wanted to reach the lost with the gospel. Secondly, we wanted to build each other up in love and obedience to God. Thirdly, we wanted to train people for ministry. And fourthly, we wanted to send out gospel workers and, God willing, other church planters. That's what we wanted to see established in this community. After about a year of working together as a team, it became clear that in order to do this, we needed a building. And the church we know it's not the building, but you do need buildings. They're really helpful. And thankfully, an opportunity came up for us in the community to purchase the old post office in the scheme. It's very hard to get property these days. It's really hard in a housing scheme because, as the name suggests, it's mainly housing. But the old post office that had been abandoned for 5 years, we were able to get that. And this is where it's really good to have, you need other churches to help you. So the guys in St. Pete's were so helpful in renovating and using, getting the building fit for purpose, the purpose that we were using it for. And Chalmers Church, as I mentioned, that I was part of, have been so helpful to us, really from the beginning all the way through. And if you know anything about that church in Edinburgh, you'll know that it has a session made up of accountants, lawyers, and property guys. And these are all areas that I know nothing about. And so these guys were just so helpful in helping us purchase or rent this property and negotiate it in a way that we weren't broke from the onset. And having gospel partnership has been so key right from the very beginning of trying to make this work. And so what we had was this building, the post office. Like I said, it's like a fishbowl. It's got these big windows going round. You can look out on the scheme. And it was perfect for just kind of day-to-day ministry. And right from the onset, we just had a drop-in cafe to get to know people. 43.8% unemployed. They're not working. A lot of them are bored. And so many started to come in. And one of the first groups that we began running was a group called Crossroads, which was an addiction recovery group. It's based off, a lot of it initially was based off material by a guy called Ed Welch, who's got a wonderful book on addiction called A Banquet in the Grave, which if you haven't read that, I would strongly recommend that, getting a theological understanding of addiction, particularly drug and alcohol addiction. And so we began this group, and there was a couple of us, two of the guys involved had worked with people in addiction before. And I remember when we started that, we were getting about 10 to 13 guys coming in, and to be honest, it was just pandemonium. It was crazy. But I remember vividly in those early days, we were looking one time at Luke chapter 18, the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, and one of the boys, his name is Alec, and he is renowned not just in Charleston but in Dundee for all the wrong reasons. He's done some pretty messed up stuff. He said to those of us who were leading that group, no one has ever taught us this before. No one's taught these guys the gospel before. They're all in like 40s and 50s. And so slowly we started to see people come along. I mean, that's what's great about being in a place that's a natural community. You get folks that just turn up. In fact, one of the first ladies to become a Christian in our church is an older woman called Anne. She came along to the door one time at the cafe and she said, "Is this a place where I can learn about the Bible and about Jesus?" I said, "Yes." She came to a Bible study group we were doing, and then she gave her life to Jesus. And I was just, thank you, Lord. Can they all be like this? That would be amazing. and she is just a great advocate for the gospel in our community. And on Sundays then, we started having this Bible study group in the post office, and then that slowly morphed into what became a Sunday service as we kind of became more and more separate from St. Peter's, our mother church, which is what you want to see, and started to establish our own church service in Charleston. And now if you were to come to a service today, if you were to come on Sunday, it's pretty basic in terms of its structure. We have a call to worship, confession of sin, assurance of pardon, so forth. I will preach for about 30 minutes, working my way systematically through a book of the Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. Some of the differences would be cultural. Like folks in Charleston, they tend to shout out a lot during the service. Not in a rude way. In fact, it's really, really encouraging because, they're not sleeping. They're engaging with the word, and they're shouting. Sometimes it's a bit random, but they're engaging with the word. I do a kind of Q&A bit just after I preach. I would say any questions, and most of the time we would get questions, and the questions are so encouraging because they're coming from guys who have never read the Bible before, who are not Christians or new Christians, and it's usually about what we've studied in the passage. I would also dress differently. Might seem trivial, but dress is important in a community like that. I'd probably just dress like this. If I wore a suit or a jumper, it would really just put guys off coming in, because their association with the church is that it's kind of for posh people, not for them. And so it is encouraging, I think, when they come in and they see that the minister's scruffier than they are, and they feel a bit more at ease. And genuinely, I've heard people say that that's been helpful. See, we don't want to have any barriers to the gospel apart from the gospel. You need to see this is for them. And so that's how we started. Now, where are we at now? Well, we're still wanting to connect with the community. It's so key that we constantly remind ourselves as a team. The launch team, the core team has changed throughout the years. But we're constantly reminding ourselves of the importance of staying engaged with the community. And we want to do that on a personal level and on a collective level. So on a personal level, even just for me, one of the things I've started doing is working with the local junior football club, Lochie United, working there as a chaplain. Let me tell you, that's really scary. These boys are not open to the gospel. And quite often I'm just standing on the sidelines like a spare tube, wondering what to do. But we have noticed that one of the groups that we're not connecting with are men who have jobs. These guys tend to be in three places: the pub, the bookies, or the football. Now, I value my life, so I'm not going to go to the pub in our community. I'm not going to go to the bookies. And so therefore, the only place really where I could go in a way that might be helpful in connecting with these men is the football. And there's a bit of bookies and pub at the football as well. And it's been great being there. It's been a reminder to me of how weak and foolish I am and how utterly dependent I am on God's grace. Because everyone initially has just been like, what's the point of us having a priest here? That's what they would call me. But 2 years into doing that, now I'm starting to have conversations. Not deep conversations, but conversations. And that's making headway. And for us, that's what I want to do. That's the group that we're really wanting to connect with. And so we would encourage people to do that on an individual level, but also we would run groups alongside that, a number of collective events. And these are things that you've all done in your churches. So for example, we'd run a mother, parent and toddler group. We've got a lot of single mums. It's been a great way for the mums in the church to connect with the mums in the scheme. And my wife's best friends would be local mums from the scheme that she has met through that toddler group. In fact, at our carol service, they were there, the mums, hearing the gospel. We run a number of youth clubs. A big issue in our community is the kids. They are the ones that cause the most trouble. The police came into us and I asked them, what's the biggest difficulty you have in Charleston? And they didn't talk about the drug dealers or the addicts. They talked about the kids. They're the hardest thing to deal with. They're the ones that are smashing the bus shelters, burning down the Christmas trees. You may have seen on the news, Dundee, Halloween time, it was like Helmand province. And that was the kids with the fireworks, just throwing them around. And so we want to run groups that connect with them. My wife runs the primary age group. And what we see is that many of these kids, they're wandering about the streets at the scheme 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night. They're 11, 12 years old. They'll frequently be at our house, which is difficult at times when I come home and there's 3 12-year-olds in my lounge and I just want to watch TV. But wonderful. And it's because my wife's a lot kinder than I am. I'm like, get them out. She's like, they've got nowhere to go. And it's great that they're there. And it shows the importance of just living in a community like that. We also run a seniors lunch club for the over 60s. We eat together at that. We usually do a 6-7 minute Bible talk. And then we do a quiz, or we have a wee game of bingo. Don't worry, there's no gambling. I think the prize at the bingo was a copy of Gentle and Lowly. We've actually we've had 5 people come to church on Sunday off the back of that. 2 of them just passed away recently from non-Christian families, and I was asked by the families to do the funerals. And I do believe that both of them made professions of faith before they died. One was 98 and the other was, I think, in her 60s. Not 98, 89, sorry. We're just thinking of different ways that we can connect with people in our community. We've started an international cafe as well for Syrians and Polish community in our schemes, various other things. And we've done loads of stuff that hasn't worked. And I do want to emphasize it's all pretty small scale, you see in some of the photos. So on Sunday we'll have about 30, so maybe a max 35 would come on a Sunday. But many of them are new Christians or non-Christians, and that's been really encouraging. And so that's a brief overview of where we are. Like I said, there's some images, you can get an idea of what that looks like on the slideshow. But what I want to do now is I want to just draw out, very briefly, 5 things that I've learned from being involved in this work, and they may or may not be helpful. 5 things, and they're really obvious, and you all know them. But it's like, I don't know, like if you went into the swimming pool and you saw a diving board that was high, it's like, yeah, I know that's high. But when you get up on the diving board and you're looking down, then you really know it's high. And so these are 5 observations, like, yeah, we know, but for me, I've just kind of like, oh, right now I really know, I really understand that. 5 observations, and then I'm keen to throw it open for questions. Here's the first, and it's obvious. Patient persistence and prayer is essential to church planting. Well, any ministry now in Scotland. Patient persistence and prayer is essential. Sounds obvious, but I don't know. I think when we started, I thought that things would happen a lot quicker than they have done. And I had my 5-year plan and my 10-year plan, and there was a touch of naivety and I think, a touch of arrogance. Here's what we're going to do. Here's how it's going to be started. Here's what we're going to look like in 5 years. Here's these other communities that we're going to try and plant churches in as well and train church planters for. Now look, we've got to have a big vision for reaching Scotland, but we need to recognize that this country is so far gone from the gospel that there is no quick fix here. I'm surrounded by people who know nothing, who have no Christian friends at all, no Christian family, and absolutely no idea what the gospel of Jesus is about. The church is utterly irrelevant to them. So before coming to Charleston, I knew that. I knew the statistics that Neil was sharing with us. But I think because prior to going to Charleston, I worked in a big church where I was surrounded by wonderful Christians. I didn't feel that. But when we were put in an environment where there's not many of you and you're surrounded by people who don't know Jesus, you see it. I mean, the most basic Bible truths people don't know. In fact, I'm sure you'll know, one of the members of our denomination was Kate Forbes. And when she was in the running to become First Minister, you knew what was coming. And it still is. Any article about Kate Forbes that you read in the BBC will mention her views on same-sex marriage and abortion, even if it's nothing to do with that. And so the news was pouncing on her, the media was pouncing on her, and somebody at the Free Church gave my name to a journalist, and I was raging about this, and my phone number, because the journalist had phoned from the Scotsman asking, what's the Free Church about, what's it doing, and somebody mentioned some of the work that we were doing in Charleston, so they gave my name and phone number. This journalist phoned from the Scotsman, and I think her title was something like, something involving, I can't remember, it's like something involving religion, for correspondent for the Scotsman. No disrespect to her, but she knew nothing about the church or the gospel. I was really surprised. Now, the article was wonderful. It was actually really encouraging what she wrote in it. But it was surprising to see just, wow, people really don't know the most basics here. Even a journalist for a national newspaper. Now, there was a time in this nation where people did know that. We can look back and we can lament. However, as the teacher tells us, Ecclesiastes 7 verse 10, this is a great verse, do not say, why were the older days better than these? For it is not wise to make such statements. Why is it not wise? Because as David Gibson says in his commentary on that, it ignores God's presence in the present. We need to just accept where we're at and learn patience. There's no quick fix here. Unless God wills that his Spirit brings revival, which we pray will happen, but prior to any revival, there's the faithful, persistent witness of his saints. We've just got to keep going, keep working hard, keep praying, and I've had to learn now to be content to die in Charleston and to see little fruit. Just maybe tilling the hard soil to lay a foundation that maybe somebody else will come along and reap the benefits from. That's where we've got to be now. There's no quick fix here. Secondly, second observation, again obvious, we have to gauge the success of our churches and our ministry by the parable of the sower. You know, I've met with some church planters. Often we meet with planters from the States, which is really encouraging, and they've helped us in many ways. But they'll tell stories of, I started my church with 50 people, and we've got 1,000 now. And I'm like, oh man, like we see more people leave than we see stay with us. And I know it is encouraging and it is God's work, but it can sometimes be disheartening when that's not what you're seeing on the ground. Now look, there are many reasons that people might walk away. It could be often, I guess it can be because of us. We're foolish, we're sinners, we make mistakes. And we need to assess all the time, are we doing something that's wrong? Are we not loving? Are we not being Christ-like in our conduct? But nevertheless, we need to recognize that our gauge for what is successful in gospel ministry is shaped by what Christ says, not what the world expects. And the parable of the sower tells us what successful gospel ministry looks like. What does it look like? It looks like a 75% rejection. 3 out of the 4 soils reject the word. And in the short years we've been doing this in Charleston, we've seen a number of people walk away. In fact, I took a note of all the people that had been in our church for more than one Sunday, and it was over 100 people. But like I said, we only have about 30. Some have left for good reasons, others have left for not so good reasons. Some of the lads I've done one-to-ones with, one is now in jail. One has gone off the rails on a bender with his drug habit. One decided to leave his wife and cheat on her and walk away from the church altogether. That's my one-to-ones. That's pretty disheartening. But Jesus said that's normal. Because I can think of 2 other lads that I've met with that love Jesus, and what they're doing now for his kingdom is great. And who knows whether it'll be 30, 60, or maybe even 100-fold. Third observation, evangelism is easy, discipleship is hard. gospel is so far gone, it's like a blank slate, and that presents great opportunities. And now what you're finding is people are actually quite interested in Jesus because they've never heard it. And what you see culturally is that ideas that people are now gravitating towards are actually just the same old ideas that come out of Christianity. So many people are interested. And so in some ways, it's kind of easy to tell people about Jesus because it's kind of fresh, it's different, it's new. But the big challenges we faced in our community are helping those who have given their life to Christ walk in obedience with Christ. I mean, in our context, I guess maybe just nationally this is the case, but it's kind of condensed in an extreme way, I think, sometimes in the scheme. People have such a twisted view of sex. One of the boys said to me the other day, he's like, Andy, you don't realize most of us lost our virginity when we were 11 years old. There's abuse issues, again, often involving sexual abuse, mental health struggles, drug and alcohol addiction. If you come to follow Jesus, you're free from all sin and you're welcomed into his kingdom. But transformation takes time. You can't expect people to just suddenly turn around when you've come out of 40 years of that lifestyle. And so discipling people through their mental health problems, through their abuse issues, through their addictions or their violent pasts, these are all things that we have had to deal with in our small church. Our elders' meetings are just spent, normally in the first hour, just praying for individuals. It's why you need elders, it's why we need each other, it's why we need to also work in conjunction with professional organisations, with doctors, addiction workers, support workers. And it's why we need to be sharing life together. It can't just be come on a Sunday, get your teaching fix, and then we'll see you next week. We have to be together, eating together, going to the cinema together, keeping God's word central, but just hanging out. You know, there's a lady in our church who's got who's real difficult struggles with her mental health, extreme anxiety issues. And another lady in our church the other week took her to the football. Now, that helped her so much. That's the great cosmic realities of the gospel of reconciliation played out in everyday life. When one person says to another, do you want to come to the football with me? That's love. And that's what we want to see. But it's hard. And we're having to deal with relapse, people walking away, people's opinions can very dramatically change about you. Discipleship's hard, really hard. Fourth observation, gospel partnership is necessary. Church planting is so lonely. I guess for those of you being in ministry, I guess ministry is in general. It's lonely. It's really lonely. And so I'm very grateful for gospel partners. I mentioned Robin Sidsurf, who has been a real mentor and support to me. If it wasn't for Robin and the elders at Chalmers, I would have quit this, definitely. I wouldn't have kept going. Lads in 20 Schemes have been a real support to me. My denomination, my presbytery has actually been really helpful as well. But we need others. It's hard. And look, the reality is, in an area like Charleston, we are not attracting Christians. Our growth strategy can't be to bring in Christians, because nobody wants to come. I get so disheartened trying to convince people to come and train with us. Nobody wants to come to Dundee, because Edinburgh's much nicer. And nobody wants to come to a housing scheme in Dundee. It looks so weak, and I don't want to live there. And the number one comment I get is, well, where will my kids go to school? I understand where that's coming from. But if the apostles had that attitude, the gospel would never have gone out of the Jerusalem nice school district. I understand where it's coming from, of having kids that go to school in this area. But it's really hard, and it can be really disheartening sometimes. Actually, I need guys round about me who'll encourage us to keep going, but also encourage us not to be bitter or self-righteous, and encourage us to show grace. You need others. Here's my final observation in all of that. Some of that might sound quite negative, but the final observation is a really positive one. Again, obvious. God's grace is amazing, and he will save his people. Final observation, God's grace is amazing, he will save his people. Many challenges. Let me just close and I'll tell you 2 encouraging stories. During lockdown, I met with one of the guys. We went out for a walk. Guys in Charleston did not. Government guidelines? No. Anyway, we went out for a walk. So we were in the guidelines. One of the boys, a lady came up, and I guess maybe because of the way I was dressed, and I was with this individual, thought I was a drug addict, came up and tried to offer me some Valium. And then the guy I was with says, no, this is the local priest. She got very embarrassed and she ran away. When we opened again, she started coming along to the church cafe. And struggles with addiction. Her daughter is struggling with an addiction, heroin addiction, pretty bad. She's got a granddaughter who's 10 years old that she looks after. But she became a Christian after a number of months. She came along to our Crossroads addiction group, studied the Bible there. Some ladies in the church really invested time in her, and she came to follow Jesus. She's working through the process of reducing her methadone. She's just got a bank account. Her granddaughter Daisy is in our house a lot. She's 10 years old. Her dad wants nothing to do with her. Her mum's a heroin addict. And now she has a family that is beyond just her blood family. Because her grand's come to know Jesus, it's affecting her. Her grand got baptized in May. Daisy's wanting to get baptized now. I was at a meeting with leaders for Free Church youth camps. We sent Daisy on one of these camps. One of the leaders said to me, that wee girl in Charleston, she knows more about the gospel than a lot of these other kids. And so what you see is that the gospel has transformed one individual's life, but it's affecting the family. And so they're great now. There's been battles there. There's been many difficulties. On Christmas, though, this lady had her granddaughter, but she had her whole wider family there at the carol service as well. And when you see the gospel starting to have an effect on generations, and God willing, Daisy will now grow up knowing the promises of God, and that'll have effect on her, and it breaks this cycle of addiction that we so often see. Second story, there was a guy who we see, he used to never come into our church, he used to always be on the outside. He was a local weed dealer as well in our community. And eventually one day he just decided that he was going to come in to our drop-in cafe. We got to know him, got to chat to him. Actually, no, he'd just gone into the jail. He came back out again, and then he connected with us and started meeting with him. I started reading the Bible with him one-to-one, and he became a Christian. And at the same time that this lady Gaynor got baptized, he would have been baptized. He was already baptized as an infant. So for Presbyterians, we wouldn't rebaptize. But on that service, he was brought into membership in the church, and he stood up and gave his testimony. His family were there, sisters were there. Both his mom and dad died when he was young, and he was able to share his testimony to these people. Now, if you were to come to Charleston Church today, you would not miss him. He's one of the first people there and the last to leave. He's very exuberant. I think the weed was kind of mellowing him out a bit, and now that's gone. He's kind of all, he's on fire for Jesus, which is great, but we're just trying to help him, again, disciple him, work through that with him. Just this past week, he's texting me, he's just got his first job that he's had in a long time, just a wee part-time cleaning job. But the gospel's transforming his life, playing out in his life, and who knows what effect that will have. He's wanting to come eventually and do an internship at the church. And our goal, and this is a long-term goal, and I'm not saying it necessarily happened with him, will be to train ministers from these communities, because he's way more effective and Gaynor's way more effective than I could ever be in reaching these people. Two people, very different, broken homes, broken lifestyle, God saved them. There's many more that we could talk about in Charleston, but God's grace is amazing and he will save his people. Let me pray, take some questions. Father God, thank you for your gospel. Thank you for your church, Jesus. Thank you that it is your plan A to reach the lost in this nation with the good news of your eternal salvation. Father, we look out, it's overwhelming at times just to think about how many people don't know you. And so we pray and ask, above all, Lord of the harvest, would you raise up laborers, laborers who will go out into this harvest field and share the good news of your salvation. Would souls be saved? Would they be discipled? Would your people be brought to worship you, Jesus? And would it all be done for the glory and honor of your name? Father, may this country be once again known as the land of the book. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Folks, any questions about that? Any thoughts, observations, questions? We've got about 10 minutes before tea or coffee. Yes?
Bible studies and stuff, if you're into a community that got no knowledge, register, what, obviously the Bible,
yeah.
Gospels,
yeah, Gospels.
You use materials and written stuff to engage people.
I think, I personally, so I would read through John's Gospel with my one-to-one guys. Our addiction group, we just went through Mark's Gospel. Some of the material, so we do have like the word one-to-one, if you've ever used that, for guys that are less confident doing that themselves. We want to encourage not just me or the elders to do that, but the church to be doing one-to-ones. So we'd use a resource called the Word One-to-One, which is very slowly just going through John's Gospel, all the stuff's there. But the Gospels, that's the key, isn't it? The whole Old Testament flows into them, the whole New flows out of them. They're like the heart, and that's what we would use. That's what I would recommend. Anyway, yeah, Mike.
You find you're not using reading materials for folk, but doing much more spoken and visual stuff?
No, so with the one-to-one stuff, I would use we'd do a gospel thing, but we also, use J.C. Ryle's book, Practical Religion. Guys in the Scheme. Just J.C. Ryle's great. See what guys in the Scheme love? When people just tell it straight. J.C. Ryle tells it straight. So they like that. Are you praying? And it's great to read that. We would use that. But I would use, like, on Sunday, I would use generally a PowerPoint, but it wouldn't be too visual. It's generally just to get the points of the sermon up. But yeah, I remember when Gaynor was round at my house and she took like a C.S. Lewis book. I can't remember. It was Mere Christianity. I said, "Oh, that's a bit. It's a bit complicated." She was like, "Don't think just because I'm from the Scheme that I don't know how to read." I was like, "Oh, so well." It was put in my place, and I think that's the case that these guys actually quite like to read a lot of them, and yeah. I think with the kids we'd use more visual stuff, but yeah, it's pretty hard on me. Sorry.
Yeah, in terms of pipeline, both you and Neil yesterday spoke about pipeline.
Yeah.
How can we help with that? What are the things that we could be doing?
Encourage guys to consider, I want to talk about just the schemes, to think about and consider. If you've got guys who are coming through and you think this guy's gifted for ministry and they could potentially go through one of the leadership pipelines or training programs that are on, encourage them to think about housing schemes as an option. Because a lot of the guys coming through will not be from schemes. In fact, are any? I don't know. And so they're not going to think about that. not through, it's just not something you would actually think about. And so encourage them to think about it, and then say, hey, there's this church in Charleston, and they're training people if you're interested. And then just punt them my way, and I would love that. We'll take them. Or, it depends what their ecclesiology is and stuff. And I mean, we would train Baptists as well. I'm not sure if the Baptists would train Presbyterians, but we would. But yeah, like my friends in 20 Schemes, they're all Baptists. And so even if it wasn't like with us, when they wanted to be trained for like somewhere else, our guy in Dundee was meeting with and was encouraging them to go and train one of the churches in Glasgow, one of the Baptist churches. So yeah, just encouraging guys to think about that, consider it, come visit. Like I've taken a couple of guys from Chalmers and just like come see what it's like, and then so you get kind of. So the reason I got involved in this really was because before 20 Schemes I spent time with Mez in Niddrie, and I was like, I get it. I need to be part of something like that. So yeah, send them to churches in these communities, and if churches in these communities have training programs, encourage them to look at that. And in your churches, just be on the lookout. We need to start raising up the next generation, don't we? Let's be on the lookout for those who are gifted and encourage them to pursue that.
When did it all start? How long have you been together as a church?
In Charleston?
Yeah.
So we're coming up almost 7 years. It's taken a long time to get what our big thing is. Just we're trying to create something stable. Everything in their lives and their community is chaos, and so in the church that's reflected because a lot of folks haven't really stuck at anything for a long time, and so trying to create a kind of constant commitment has been challenging.
Housing scheme churches in the Church of Scotland, big thing has been that the minister is the one person who stays.
Yeah.
The teachers, the head teachers, they move to better schools if they can, get promotion, whatever. But the social workers, they move on.
Yeah.
The minister stays, the Christian church stays.
I don't think that's just the Church of Scotland. I think generally that's why a lot of these churches and schemes have been shut down and dying. And for many of the guys in our community, we'll see that as just something that's kind of irrelevant to them. And so, like I said, we were keen not to plant a service, but a church, which meant we had to be there because the church is more than the Sunday service, as essential as that is. And if they look in and see middle-class guys coming in to their community to meet in that building and then leave again, that's not going to have any impact. It just won't. It actually could have the opposite impact. It pushes people away.
Andy, how hard is it to get a sort of sweep of the Old Testament into folks' minds? Is that something you sort of explicitly do, or just?
Yeah. Do you know what? I think that's hard, regardless of the context. Like I remember when I was we're about to do Ezekiel in Charleston, and I remember doing that in Chalmers, and the amount of folks that are like, "Well, we just didn't know," like what the exile was and the history behind it. So I think, I think that's challenging everywhere. But what you find, we're doing a bit of Matthew at the moment. When you do the Gospels, it's really, really hard to get the full weight and impact and understanding of the Gospels without the Old Testament. I mean, God in his wisdom thought, I'm not going to send Jesus straight away. I'm going to give my people 2,000 years of Israelite history so they can understand the necessity of Jesus and what Jesus was like and why and how we value him. And so you need actually that to understand a lot of the Gospels. Because I was doing the Transfiguration on Sunday past. I had to right guys, we've got to talk about the Exodus, we've got to talk about Elijah, and these are things that are essential. So I think that's challenging. It's challenging keeping that simple and accessible. And most of my prep time is taking my sermons to the treadmill and simplifying it down and trying to get it more simple. I spend more time doing that, I think, than kind of just understanding it.
I've just finished 16 years in a housing estate church, and I just want to affirm everything you've just said. I've been really encouraged, by what you've said. two observations about ministry that I draw from. One is, in working class communities, people assume, sometimes middle class people assume that they haven't got a capacity for expository ministry, whereas they love really getting into the big picture of the Bible. They love it when it's explained.
Yes.
They love talking about spirituality, Satan, evil, original sin. It makes sense to their world, to heroin, to addiction, to all of that. And then the astonishing grace of Jesus. It's a joy to explain it. Where I really struggled, probably in the earlier years, but where I did find real difficulty was the mental health.
Yes.
And the pastoral demands. And in the early years, I was overwhelmed by them. And in the end, I found you had to take a step back and just be patient and let the Lord work over time. And using the parable of the sower as a fundamental picture of what ministry is like in the estate. You just have to really hope that minority will blossom. I mean, how are you coping with the mental health pastorally? I find that the most difficult aspect.
We're really struggling. It's learning to not take certain things personally. We've got a woman who was kept in a dog's cage as a child and has severe insecurity issues. And will text me maybe every 2 months saying, I'm leaving, I want nothing to do with the church. And it's like, I know that she's not, but there's these panics, these anxieties. She goes to a house group, she freaks out because she got a question wrong. And you learn not to take anything personal, and having others that will help you not get frustrated sometimes, like having to constantly say the same thing. And with that, and with the addiction stuff's so repetitive, but it's such a great teacher as well about the grace of God. Because how many times do I muck up and go to God with the same thing, and he never once turns me away. And so I'm reminded, like, gosh, like when I'm frustrated, I'm like, how frustrated must God be with me every day? Because yet again, it's like, here's Andy again with the same issues. He's doing it again. He's been so daft, and yet he's always showing me grace. And so letting it also instruct us to the understanding of what our God is like is helpful. But you need people around about you. You need to know when to stop. I think in a lot of cases, you obviously need to refer to professional help. You're not there to solve all these problems. You're there to help disciple them and help them walk in their spiritual life, but they need other help in other areas, courage in that. And I think with the expositional preaching, like I took Gaynor and Billy, the two from the scheme that I mentioned there, I took them to Chalmers one time, and Robin Sid Surf went off script and preached for about 45 minutes, and you could see the people in Chalmers being like, kind of like, oh, this is going on. And our guys loved it. They were like, this is amazing. So Robin's preached in Charleston actually twice, and I think he loves coming because they're just like, give us an hour, like, and I'm like, oh man, don't do that. But they're just like they kind of absorb it up. And one of the things you mentioned that's really important, and I think we'll just close with this, is that grace has to be central to all of it. The dominant religion in the scheme, and I think the dominant religion in Scotland, is the religion of being a good bloke. Moralism. So the guys in our community have no trouble, particularly guys in addiction, have no trouble accepting the fact that they are sinners. They have a lot of trouble accepting the fact that I'm a sinner. Because you're the priest, the minister. You can't be a sinner. Their definition of sin is actually really tiny. It's about drugs and stealing. And it's helping see the total depravity of our nature. And always reminding them, without Jesus, I deserve to spend an eternity in hell. That's what I'm like. And help feed that into them and remind them, but with Jesus I've been reconciled back to God, and his grace is greater than our sin, and constantly remind them of grace, because that's so countercultural, and moralism will always feed its way into their thinking in discipleship. And so you're keeping grace always at the forefront and constantly, and you need to remind it to yourselves, because we naturally drift towards Pharisaism or moralism, and we need grace constantly. Let me stop. Sorry.